Hey everyone, this is Charlie Lofton, lead pastor at the Grove Church, and thanks for joining us on our Cultivate podcast. And we are in a series where we're working our way through just kind of the big picture of the Bible, the chronology of it. It's we're borrowing some material that I first encountered when, over 25 years ago. That's developed by Robert Cupp and Fellowship Northwest Arkansas. It's called Panorama of the Bible. We're kind of breaking the Bible down into 12 sections chronologically to kind of help us understand the big picture story of the Bible and ultimately to help us understand where the different pieces fit together. We started with the prologue, which is Genesis 1 through 11, which kind of gives us the intro to the main character of the Bible, which is God, and kind of the main conflict, which is the people that he's created and the people that he created for relationship and the people that he created for worship, and that he made creation so that they could celebrate and enjoy this with him, are essentially rebellious and selfish. And what is God going to do about that? And we see this in the Garden of Eden. We see it with Noah. We see it in the Tower of Babel. And that gives us kind of the intro to this conflict. But then in our second one, last episode, we looked at the patriarchs, and we see this new idea that God has on how to reconcile the world to him and to restore this idea that the world be full of people who are in a covenant worship relationship with God. And so he calls Abram and he makes this covenant with him to say that he was going to turn him into a great nation, and through him would bless every nation and every group of people on the earth. And so God has this plan of kind of raising up a group of people to show the world what a covenant relationship with God looks like. So the overwhelming blessing, the connection, the spiritual and personal prosperity that comes from that God's going to bless them so much that all of the world is going to be attracted to that and want to be in a covenant blessing relationship with the one true God. And so that we see that pass from Abraham to his son Isaac, and from Isaac he had two sons, Jacob and Esau, and it passes to Jacob. And then from Jacob he has 12 sons, which become the 12 tribes of Israel. And most of the story centers around Joseph, even though kind of the primary blessing of kind of where the is really going to ultimately come through Judah, who is going to be the great grandfather of King David and ultimately of Jesus. So we're going to see that part of the blessing primarily go through Judah, even though the story is primarily about Joseph, but ultimately the blessing extends to all 12 tribes who become kind of the foundational patriarchs for the entire Jewish nation. And in that story that we left with Joseph, he is sold into slavery by his brothers, ultimately ends up in Egypt as a slave, and through some integrity on his part, some luck, quote unquote luck, but really the hand of God, he ends up as the second in command of all of Egypt, overseeing Egypt and really the whole region as kind of a governor and navigating them through this terrible famine. And so again, through Jacob and Joseph's other brothers coming to Egypt to buy food, they ultimately are reunited with Joseph, and after a while end up moving to Egypt to be with Joseph. And so we end Genesis with Jacob, 12 sons. They are in Egypt, and they are no longer in the land that God has promised. And we see this theme that we've already seen a little bit in Genesis, and we'll continue to see in different parts of the Old Testament, of just this idea of God's people not looking to God for help in trouble, but looking to Egypt. And Egypt kind of becomes not just the country, but also just a symbol for a kingdom of power, a kingdom of taking, a kingdom of greed, not a kingdom that is focused on the worship and connection and being in a covenant relationship with God. And so we really kind of have the most serious example of this here, where they have now moved, not just simply are eating the food and buying food from Egypt to take care of them during a famine, but are actually living there. And once the famine is over, they don't move back. And again, this is some significant foreshadowing that ends up with us in Exodus chapter 1. And ultimately, the name of this section is called Redemption and Wandering. And in Exodus chapter 1, we see this. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. But the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. And ultimately what we need a verse here that says, and so then of course they moved back to the promised land to live in the place that God had set for them so they could be a nation set apart, to be the blessing and all these things. But that is not what happened. They stay in Egypt. Verse 8, then a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. So what we have here is that ultimately a Pharaoh comes into power who does not know about what Joseph did, or just doesn't care about what Joseph did, doesn't care that Joseph essentially saved Egypt and led them well through this famine and was second in command. They didn't care about any of that. And ultimately all they see in Israel is a threat. They are experiencing and seeing how God is prospering them, and they see it as a threat. And so the people who have been living and depending on Egypt rather than living in God's promised land and depending on him are ultimately placed into slavery. And what happens is that this is the situation for them for 400 years. And if you just want to ask about the things that just kind of make me just kind of go, whoa, we've kind of talked about one of them with Noah, essentially him wiping out the entire population except for Noah and his family. But he's like, well, the grace of God was that he gave them 120 years to repent and join the Noah team, and they didn't. And we got another one here. It's like, man, for 400 years they lived in slavery in Egypt. I mean, that's serious. That's like that's a whoa kind of moment, because ultimately by the time the story of Moses, who's going to be our main character here in this section of redemption and wandering, ultimately by the time we come to here, man, there's no one in Israel who ever met anyone who was not a slave. So you're a young guy and you know your grandpa, and your grandpa, his grandpa, all anybody knew of anybody was slavery and this dark situation. And so it really is just kind of a really heavy moment in here of just like, of really what the consequences are of looking to this kingdom of Egypt rather than going to and looking to God. So, but ultimately it says that God hears the cries of his people and essentially is going to raise up a deliverer. And that's where we meet Moses. And we meet Moses during a time when there is a significant oppression going out from the Egyptians onto the Hebrews, where they're so worried about them, that's like, we need to start killing some of their sons. And ultimately, Moses' mom protects him by putting him in a basket and sending him down the river, which is a little bit scary, but it's better than him been dying. And then ultimately, the princess of Egypt finds him and raises Moses as her own son. And so what we have here is God has raised up an Israelite by birth, and still has some connections with his birth family, because again, just through some awesome machinations, the hand of God and a very clever mom and sister, his birth mom ends up being his nurse as well, but he is raised as a prince of Egypt. Maybe you've seen the movie by the same name. So he's a prince of Egypt. And so what we have here is someone who is going to be raised in the house of Pharaoh, raised as a noble, and has all this power, all this influence, all these connections, but is also an Israelite. And as he grows to become an adult, he begins to see the oppression of his own people, and his heart begins to break. And then he makes the mistake of, rather than doing something constructive about it, he kills an Egyptian. And the word of this begins to get out, and other Israelites are kind of taunting him about it. Ultimately, the current Pharaoh hears about it. It was probably a brother, uncle to Moses, and he said, "Well, I'm going to kill Moses," and Moses has to flee. And again, the timeline of this, Moses, who we can very tell is that God is going to be the one that God is going to use to deliver. After this murder, he goes and lives in the wilderness for 40 years. 40 years. I mean, just the timelines here of just what it really takes to kind of reform, to bring healing. We have these pretty lengthy periods of time. But ultimately, while he's there, and maybe you're familiar with this story, Moses encounters God on a mountaintop when he sees a burning bush, that it's on fire but will not be consumed by the fire. And in that, he hears the voice of God, and God calls him to go and free the people of Israel from slavery in Egypt. Moses tries to talk back and say, I'm not the one, not me, I'm not a very good talker. And it's like, it is you, go do it. So Moses goes back to Egypt, reunites with his brother Aaron, and together they go and talk to Pharaoh. Again, no regular Israelite would have been able to do this because he has the access, because of who he is. He's able to get an audience before Pharaoh and ask Pharaoh to let people go. And then if you're familiar with this story, it's kind of the 10 plagues. These 10 plagues where, the Pharaoh would say that you can let him go. I'll let him go, and then changes his mind. And God brings all of these plagues on the people of Israel, against the people of Egypt. And ultimately, each one of these plagues, it's pretty cool when you kind of get in the weeds of it. Each one of these plagues is connected to one of the gods of Egypt. And so he's communicating both to his people, the Israelites, and to the Egyptians, that the gods that they have put their faith and their trust in are actually controlled by the capital G God. These are not real gods. Capital G God is the real God. And that the God of Israel is the real God. And so even in these plagues, we are seeing moments of God reaching out to the Egyptians. Like, you don't understand what you've done here. You have God's people. You need to repent of these false gods, and you need to recognize the blessing that I have on my people, and rather being threatened by it, by enslaving them, by trying to murder them, you need to reject your gods and follow me. And so even in the punishment, there are glimpses of God's grace and his desire not just to redeem the Israelites, but to also let that blessing spread to the Egyptians. And so he is giving, especially I think in all of these plagues, he is giving an opportunity for the Egyptians to turn from all of their own sin and recognize God and follow God instead. And I think also we see the incremental nature of these plagues, that they get progressively worse. He's just giving them an opportunity. But it ultimately ends with the firstborn of every family in Egypt dying, and ultimately Pharaoh finally releasing the Israelites to go. So Moses is leading them. They ultimately get to the Red Sea, and we're not going to have a difficult time crossing. And at that point, Pharaoh changes his mind and sends his army after them. And again, a story that you may be familiar with. God is there with them. Moses lifts up his hand, the Red Sea parts. The Israelites walk across on dry ground, and by the time they get across, the army is behind them, and they get swept up in by the water, and God saves them. And so now we have them on this journey as they're moving from Egypt back to the land that God has promised them, the land where Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, where they had all lived, to go back to that from Egypt. And again, this story has just a lot of cycles to it where they get concerned, they get frustrated that God isn't providing well enough. And we see a combination, as we see all throughout the scripture, of a very gracious God who is very patient, but at the same time there are consequences for the sin and rebellion against God. And kind of one of the culminating moments of this happens in Mount Sinai. In this Mount Sinai, they kind of have this renewal of the covenant. Moses goes up the mountain to meet one-on-one with God, which is where he gets the 10 Commandments, which kind of start then the law. And while this is happening, Aaron, his brother, and all the people, Moses is gone too long, they get scared and they decide to build a golden calf idol. And so just a real interesting picture of God kind of revealing himself in this very personal way to Moses, kind of reinforcing this covenant, putting this law together to help them understand how to live, while you've got this incredible connection happening between Moses and God. We've got this people dancing around this golden calf and worshiping an idol that is meant to represent God. We've got this great rebellion that's happening at the bottom. And so Moses comes down, and it just goes about the way that you expect. Moses is mad, God's mad, people get punished, but it really becomes this really kind of sacred moment for them. As Moses reaffirms this covenant, we have this rebellion, we have the repentance from it, and the hope then is that this is going to be a real big turning point for the Israelite. And it is a very significant time for them, is when they look back on Mount Sinai. This time is a very holy time for the Israelites. So they continue on, they're working their way back to the promised land, and finally they get to the very edge of it, and they send out 12 spies, 2 of which are named Joshua and Caleb. And of these 12 spies, only Joshua and Caleb come back and say, hey, they're kind of big and scary, but God is God, let's go do it. And everybody else, the other 10, get really, really scared. And they say that we shouldn't do it. And God gets really mad. It's like, I thought you guys trusted me, and they don't. And so he says, well, fine. Anybody who's an adult right now will never go to that promised land. And instead, you're going to have to wander around in the wilderness for 40 years. And once you're all dead, we'll give your kids another shot. And they're very upset. And they're like, no, we can do it. And so they decide to go fight the next day anyway, but without God's blessing with them. And they get routed. And so ultimately then what Moses has to do is lead them away from the promised land, where they essentially just kind of wander around in the wilderness for 40 years, where what God said would happen happened. All the people who were adults, they pass away, except for Joshua and Caleb, who God promised, because you were faithful and gave a good report, I'll let you see the promised land. And so after these 40 years, they're going to end up back at the promised land, but not before Moses kind of has his bad moment, where the people are complaining again that they don't have any water. And the last time that this happened, God said, hey, hit this rock with a stick and I'll make water come out of it. And it did. The next time that this happens, God says, I want you to talk to the rock. And instead of talking to the rock, Moses hits it with his stick twice, which is, again, is an act of rebellion against God. It is defying God, and because of the leadership position that Moses had, and not just simply just being someone who complains about God, but essentially defies God as a leader in the presence of everyone, God says, well, that's going to be it for you. I'm going to let you lead them all the way back to the promised land, but you're not going to get to go in either. And so then they ultimately then end up back on the edge of the promised land. And he lets Moses get up on a mountain and see it, but he doesn't get to enter it. And instead, Joshua is going to be the one that gets to lead the people into the promised land, which will then ultimately lead us to section number 4. And so this basically, this section on redemption and wandering covers the next 4 books of the Bible, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And it includes these stories that go from them being enslaved to the story of Moses, to the 10 plagues, their journey out of Egypt, their defiance, they're in Canaan on the edge of the promised land, their wanderings, and they get back. It also includes a giving of the law, not just the 10 commandments, but all of the law that they are supposed to live by once they are established as their own nation. Their dietary laws, their government laws, and their moral laws. I'm sure we'll talk about this at some point, but you just need to write that down somewhere. There's 3 different categories essentially for these laws. Some are just really these kind of health codes. Some of them are health codes, legal codes, kind of that's one of them. Another one is kind of about how they're supposed to worship, and the other ones are moral codes. And so when you ask kind of the question is like, well, which one of these are kind of stick? It's the one where God declares what is good and what is bad. We worship differently now, and obviously we govern ourselves differently now, but it's really more about the moral code. But this all happens. You get this in Leviticus, Numbers, again, we're doing a lot of census taking. We're wandering around again. And Deuteronomy is the second giving of the law. It's really what that means, second law. And so they're on the edge of the promised land again. And as they're about to go in, Moses is like, hey, you need to remember the law, and essentially repeats the law to them again. So if you're ever reading through the Bible and you're going through Leviticus and it's got all the laws in there and you're like, man, that was difficult to read. That wasn't enjoyable. And then you walk around to Deuteronomy, he's like, I think I've read all of this before. I assure you have, and it was just 2 books ago. And that's why most people get discouraged as they're trying to read through the Bible as a whole. They struggle through Leviticus because reading all of these laws seems tedious. And if you survive that, you get to Deuteronomy where you have to read it all over again, and most people quit. So if you're trying to read through the Bible and I encourage you, keep going past Deuteronomy. It's worth it. The story gets really interesting when we get to Joshua. So again, we're covering these 4 books. Exodus, which is primarily the story of Moses, how they got out, going to Sinai, the beginnings of the law. Leviticus is just kind of a full rendering of the law. Numbers are taking a census. We get some more information on the story about the wanderings around and the rejection there in Canaan right before they have to wander. And then Deuteronomy, where they find themselves back on the edge, ready to take over again. But Moses reads the law to them one more time, and it ends with the death of Moses. So we're now 3 sections deep here. We've talked about the prologue, where we kind of get the intro to the characters, the main themes, the relationship between God and his people, his need and his desire to reconcile them to himself. And we see just kind of begin the character of God and how he's going to react to this rebellion. We see this plan that comes to fruition there with the patriarchs as God is raising up his own tribe, his own people through Abraham, then Isaac, then Jacob, then through the 12 tribes. And then because of their dependence and their leaning on Egypt over God, they find themselves in a really difficult situation in slavery for a long period of time. But God, who never gives up on anybody, no matter how serious or significant their failure or their sin is, raises up Moses to come in to redeem them, to bring them out, and to take them to the promised land, to which they fail the first time. They wander around, and they're back for a second go-around, which again will lead us to section 4, starting with the book of Joshua. So I encourage you to keep staying with this, keep listening to this podcast so we can get this big picture idea, story of kind of how the whole Bible fits together. And as always, we'd love to see you. I'm Charlie Lofton, lead pastor at The Grove. We would love to see you on a Sunday morning if you're local. You go to thegrovechurch.org/connect, get all the details you need about the whens and wheres of our service. But if you're not, you can join us online. You get the details about that at thegrovechurch.org/connect too. Catch one of our streaming services. Either way, we'd love to know that you're listening. Any way that you can help us, you can fill out that card there at thegrovechurch.org/connect. Again, thanks for joining us on our Cultivate podcast.